All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're still on World War II, Ebb of Aggression, 1941 to 1945, on page 737. All right. By the beginning of 1941, the Japanese attack on China had bogged down and was in such imminent danger of collapse that something drastic had to be done. But there was no agreement within Japan as to what direction such drastic action should take. A timid majority existed, even within the Japanese government itself, which would have been willing to withdraw from the Chinese incident if this could have been done without too great loss of face. On the whole, this group was timid and ineffectual because of the danger of assassination by the extreme militarist and hyper-nationalist groups within Japan. Moreover, it was impossible to reach any agreement with the Chinese nationalist government which would allow Japan to retain its face by covering a real withdrawal from China with an apparent diplomatic triumph of some sort. The advocates of an aggressive policy in Japan were divided among the insignificant group who still believed that an all-out assault on China could be brought to a successful conclusion, and the more influential groups who would have sought to redeem the stalemate in China by shifting the offensive against either Soviet Siberia or the rich Anglo-Dutch possessions of Malaysia and Indonesia. In the long run, the group which advocated a drive to the south was bound to prevail, because Malaysia and Indonesia were obviously weak and rich, while Soviet Siberia lacked those items, such as petroleum, rubber, or tin, which Japan most urgently needed, and it had demonstrated its power in the battles of 1938 to 1939. Germany, which originally encouraged the Japanese to move southward against British Malaysia, and then, when it was too late, sought to redirect the Japanese blow against Siberia, played an insignificant role in Japan's policy. The decision to move southward, where the defense was weaker and the prizes so much greater, was made in an ambiguous and half-hearted way in the summer of 1941. The critical turning point was probably during the last week in July. During the 6-week period, March 12th through April 22nd, Matsuoka, the fire-eating foreign minister, was absent from Tokyo on a visit to Berlin and to Moscow. In the German capital, he was advised to make no political agreements with the Soviet Union because of the imminent approach of war between that country and Germany. Matsuoka at once went to Moscow, where he signed a Soviet-Japanese neutrality pact on April 13, 1941. In the meantime, in March, Japanese diplomats won special economic concessions in Siam, while in June, the 9-month-old trade discussions with the Netherlands East Indies broke down without Nippon obtaining any of the concessions it desired. These agreements, if obtained, might have put Japan in a position where it could have withstood a total American petroleum embargo. Failure to obtain these meant that Japan's large oil reserves would continue to decrease to the point where Japan would be militarily helpless from total lack of oil. America could accelerate this process by either curtailing the supply of oil or by forcing Japan into actions which would increase the rate of its consumption. Japanese oil production in 1941 was only 3 million barrels a year compared to a consumption rate of about 32 million barrels a year. Reserves, which had been 55 million barrels in December 1939, were below 50 million in September 1941 and fell to about 43 million by Pearl Harbor. On July 21, 1941, Japan's threats won from Vichy France the right to move troops into southern Indochina. This was a threat to British Malay rather than to the Burma Road in China. Within a week, on July 26, 1941, the United States froze all Japanese financial assets in the United States, virtually ending trade between the two countries. The members of the British Commonwealth issued similar orders, while the Netherlands, Indies established special licenses for all exports to Japan. No licenses were issued for vital commodities like oil or bauxite. In the same week, an American military mission went to China, and the Philippine Army was incorporated into the American Army. As a result of these pressures, Japan found itself in a position where the oil reserves would be exhausted in 2 years, its aluminum reserves in 7 months. The chief of the General Staff of the Japanese Navy told the emperor that if Japan resorted to a war to break this blockade, it would be very doubtful that it could win. The president of the Japanese Planning Board confirmed this gloomy opinion. The armed forces insisted that Japan had a choice between a slow decline to extinction under economic pressure or war, which might allow it to break out of its predicament. The Navy had little hope of victory in such a war, but agreed with this analysis. It was also agreed that war, if it came, must begin before the middle of December, when weather conditions would become too adverse to permit amphibious, belligerent operations. It was clear that economic pressure was too damaging to allow Japan to postpone such operations until the resumption of good weather in 1942. Accordingly, the decision was made to make war in 1941, but to continue negotiations with the United States until late October. If an agreement could be reached by that date, the preparations for war could be suspended. Otherwise, the negotiations would be ended and the advance to open war continued. Matsuoka, the foreign minister, who was opposed to continuing the negotiations with the United States, was dropped from the cabinet on July 16th. From that date on, the civilian portion of the cabinet desperately sought to reach an agreement in Washington, while the military portion calmly prepared for war. In the course of 1941, Japan's preparations for war were gradually expanded from a project to close the southern routes into China by an attack on Malay to an attack on the United States. The decision to close the Burma Road by force meant that Japan must move into French Indochina and Siam and cross British Malay. After neutralizing the British Navy base at Singapore, such a movement had numerous disadvantages. It would mean war with Britain. It would leave the Japanese lines of communication southward open to a flank attack from American bases in the Philippines. It was doubtful if China could be defeated even when all the Western supplies were cut off. After all, these supplies were so insignificant in 1940, Americans' arms and munitions to China were worth only $9 million. Even a total defeat of China would leave Japan's material shortages acute, especially in respect to the greatest material need, petroleum products. In view of these disadvantages, under which Japan would expend so much to gain so little, it seemed to many Japanese leaders that very considerable gains could be obtained only with a slight additional effort if an attack on the rich Netherland Indies were combined with an attack on Malay and the Burma Road. Such an advance to the tin and bauxite of Malay and to the oil of the Dutch Indies had every advantage over any alternative possibility, such as an attack on eastern Siberia, especially as the Japanese army, but not the navy, had a higher opinion of Soviet power than they had of Anglo-American strength. Having given the attack on Malay and Indonesia the preference over any possible attack on Siberia, the Japanese leaders accepted the fact that this would mean war with Britain and the United States. In this, they were probably not wrong, although some Americans have claimed that America would not have gone to war if Japan had passed by the Philippines and left other American territories untouched on its road to the south. It is certainly true that such actions would have touched off a violent controversy within the United States between the isolationist and the interventionist, but it seems almost certain that the policies of the Roosevelt administration would have been carried out, and these policies included plans for war against Japan's southern movement even if American areas were not attacked. In any case, judging American reactions in terms of their own, the Japanese decided that an American flank attack from the untouched Philippines on their extended communications to the southward would be too great a risk to run. Accordingly, an attack on the Philippines to prevent this was included in the Japanese plans for their southern movement. This decision led at once to the next step, the project to attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on the grounds that an inevitable war with the United States could be commenced most effectively with a surprise attack on the American Navy, rather than by waiting for an intact American fleet to come to seek out the Japanese in their zones of active operation in the southwestern Pacific. It must be recognized that one of the chief factors impelling the Japanese to make the attack on Pearl Harbor was that few Japanese, and these mostly in the army, had any hope that Japan could defeat the United States in any war carried to a decisive conclusion. Rather, it hoped that, by crippling the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japan could conquer such a large area of the southwestern Pacific and southeastern Asia that peace could be negotiated on favorable terms. Here, once again, the Japanese misjudged American psychology. The negotiations in Washington between Hisaburo Nomura and Secretary Hull were among the strangest diplomatic discussions ever carried on. Although Nomura probably was not informed of the Japanese plan to make war, he could not have failed to infer them because he had received instructions that he must reach an agreement by late October if peace were to be preserved. He found it impossible to reach such an agreement because Hull's demands were extreme and his own superiors in Tokyo were unwilling to make any political concessions to win a relaxation of economic restrictions. The Americans had a clear view of the situation because they had broken the secret Japanese codes and generally had Nomura's instructions from Tokyo before he did. Thus, the Americans knew that Nomura had no powers to yield on any vital political issue, that he had been given a deadline in October, and that war would begin if he failed to obtain relaxation of the economic embargo before that deadline. They did not, however, have any details on the Japanese military plans, since these were not communicated by radio, and they did not realize that these plans included an attack on Pearl Harbor. In the course of November, American naval intelligence knew that Japanese armed forces were mobilizing and moving southward. By November 20th, it became clear that a task force of the Navy, including 4 of the largest Japanese aircraft carriers, had vanished. At the end of November, Intercepted Japanese messages showed clearly that the negotiations were no longer of significance. In early December, these showed that the Japanese embassy in Washington had been ordered to destroy all its codes and to prepare its staff for departure. The negotiations between Hull and Nomura were lengthy, technical, and hopeless. In essence, they boiled down to the conclusion that America would not relax its economic restrictions on Japan unless 1. Japan promised to refrain from acts of force in the Southwest Pacific area. 2. Japan agreed to violate its treaty with Germany to permit the United States to support Britain, even to the point of war with Germany, without any Japanese intervention on the side of Germany. And 3. That Japan would agree to withdraw its armed forces from Indochina and from China and restore equality of economic opportunity in the latter country on a schedule to be worked out later. When it became clear on October 15, 1941, that agreement was impossible, Hideki Tojo, leader of the activist military group in Japan, forced Prince Fumimaro Konoye, I don't know how to pronounce that second one, Konoye, so it's Fumimaro Konoye, to resign. The new cabinet had General Tojo as premier, Minister of the Army, Minister of Home Affairs, controlling domestic police. This was clearly a war government, but the negotiations continued in Washington. Hold up. Do this real quick. Small, whatever. It's all good. Wait, let me look what about that one's kind of cool too. All right. All right. On November 10th, operation orders were issued to the Japanese Navy to destroy the American fleet in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Orders had already been issued to conquer Thailand, Malaya, the Philippines, Borneo, and Sumatra. The rest of the Netherlands East Indies were to be taken in a second movement, and all the conquered areas enclosed in a defensive perimeter to run from the Japanese Kurule Islands through Wake Islands and the Marshall Islands along the southern and western edge of Timor, Java, Sumatra, and the Burma-India border. By November 20th, the American defensive forces knew that Japan was about to strike, but it still felt that the blow would be southward. On November 27th, a war warning was sent from Washington to Pearl Harbor, but no changes were made there for increased precautions or a higher level of alertness. That's interesting. I'm going to put a post-it note in that, because a lot of people have to say that Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy, that the Americans knew that it was going to happen and they kind of let it happen. So we'll put a pen in that. Fortunately, the three carriers of American Pacific Fleet were not in Pearl Harbor on the morning of the attack, but the Japanese had detailed anchorage sites for the vessels which were there, including 7 battleships and 7 cruisers. The Japanese attack force consisted of 6 carriers with 450 planes, escorted by 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 20 regular submarines, and 5 midget submarines. This force, in complete radio silence and without encountering any other vessels, sailed in 11 days in a great northward circle from the Kurils to a point 275 miles north of Pearl Harbor. From that point, at 6 a.m. on December 7, 1941, was launched an airstrike of 360 planes, including 40 torpedo planes, 100 bombers, 130 dive bombers, and 90 fighters. The 5 midget submarines, dropped from larger submarines, were already operating at Pearl Harbor and were able to enter because the anti-torpedo net was carelessly left open after 4:58 a.m. on December 7th. Okay, so the anti-torpedo net was left open. They had some type of messages knowing that there was some type of attack coming. Interesting. These submarines were detected at 3:45 before they entered the harbor, but no warning was sent until 6:54 after one had been attacked and sunk. Interesting. About the same time, an Army enlisted man using radar detected a group of strange planes coming down from the north 132 miles away, but his report was disregarded. At 7:30, an enlisted sailor noticed 24 planes about a mile over his ship, but did not report it. In the next half hour, these early arrivals from the Japanese carriers were joined by others, and at 7:55 the attack began. Within 30 minutes, the battle line of the Pacific Fleet was wiped out. The American losses included 2,400 men killed, almost 1,200 wounded, 4 battleships sunk, with 3 others badly damaged, and many other vessels sunk or damaged, and hundreds of planes destroyed on the ground. The greatest damage was inflicted by special shallow water torpedoes launched from planes which came in below the 100-foot altitude. In all, the Japanese losses were small, amounting to no more than a couple dozen planes, because the surprise was so great. The Japanese fleet was not found after the attack because the search order was issued 180 degrees off direction through an error of interpretation. So, wow, they got away too. So, Americans knew they were coming, kinda, sort of. They left the torpedo nets open, kinda, sorta. And then when they went to look for the attacking group of planes, they made a mistake, but I'm sure whoever sent them said mission accomplished right after they sent them in the wrong direction. All right. Pearl Harbor was but one of several attacks made by the Japanese in their opening assaults on December 7th through 10th. Air attacks on Wake Island, Midway Islands, Guam, the Philippines, and Malaya destroyed hundreds of planes, mostly on the ground, and set fire to large stores of supplies. Lack of anti-aircraft facilities, inadequate air power and fields, and carelessness by higher officers transformed the defenders' situation from critical to hopeless, although personal bravery and resourcefulness made the Japanese pay heavily for their gains. Midway Island, 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu and linked to it by a very important cable, survived a hit-and-run attack of December 8, 1941, and by 1942 was America's westernmost base, especially valued for planes, submarines, and reconnaissance. Wake Island, 1,200 miles southwest of Midway, was struck on December 8th and surrendered on December 23rd after a heavy two-day assault. Guam, 1,500 miles west of Wake, and in the midst of the Japanese-mandated Mariana Islands, was invaded at the beginning and gave up on December 10th. The Philippines, 3,000 miles west of Wake, were attacked by landings at 9 points in the 17 days before Christmas. By December 27th, the Japanese had compelled the American ground forces to evacuate Manila and to retire into their last defense areas, the rocky caves of the island of Corregidor and the forest of the Bataan Peninsula. Savage fighting continued until May 6, 1942, when the last American forces on Corregidor surrendered. The commanding officers, General Douglas MacGregor and Admiral Thomas Hart, had already withdrawn to Australia. 1,500 miles west of the Philippines, a Japanese army invaded Thailand from Indochina and on December 9th captured Bangkok without a struggle. About the same time, Japanese landings were made on the Malay Peninsula north of Singapore, when the British battle cruiser Repulse and the new battleship Prince of Wales ventured north without air cover since their accompanying carrier Indomitable ran aground. They were sunk by Japanese land-based planes December 10th. These were the only Allied capital ships west of Pearl Harbor, but the event had much more significance than this. It showed that the capital ship was no longer the mistress of the sea, as it had been for at least 2 generations, and by doing so, it showed that American losses at Pearl Harbor, concentrated as they were on battleships, were not nearly so important as they had seemed to be. But even more significant, these sinkings off the east coast of Malaya marked the end of British supremacy on the seas, which had begun with the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588. For the next 2 years, supremacy on the seas was in dispute, but at the end of that time, the decision was falling clearly in favor of a new champion, the United States. Fanning outward as they spread over the southwestern Pacific and southeastern Asia, the Japanese forces captured Hong Kong on December 25, 1941, and advanced on Singapore across the swamps on its landward side. The great naval base, the bastion of all British power in the Far East, had to surrender on February 15, 1942, without even being able to defend itself, its great guns aimed seaward at an army which never came, being completely useless against the Japanese who crept up on it from the landward side. Lying north of Australia, in a great curve from Singapore to New Guinea, was the Malay Barrier, originally intended to form the southern perimeter of the Japanese defense area. Like beads on a necklace across a distance of 3,500 miles were stretched dozens of islands: Sumatra, Java, Bali, Lombok, Flores, Timor, New Guinea, and others. These were taken so rapidly by the Japanese octopus that the straits between the various islands were closed before some Allied ships could escape through to the south. 5 Allied cruisers and many destroyers were caught in this way and sunk in the week of February 26, 1942. Sumatra, Java, and Timor surrendered by March 9th, and the Netherlands forces were wiped out. British forces withdrew to Ceylon, and the few surviving American vessels limped home for repairs. Rangoon, the Burmese capital, surrendered on March 8th, and exactly a month later, the triumphant Japanese naval forces swept westward to strike Ceylon. In the first week of April, Holy Week of 1942, Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, made a similar attack on Ceylon, sinking the British carrier Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and many lesser vessels, including 136 tons of merchant ships. This dark moment, mid-April of 1942, the tide of the battle in the Pacific began to turn. 3 American aircraft carriers, which had been spared at Pearl Harbor, Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga, were joined by one of the 2 carriers from the Atlantic, Yorktown. These, with cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships, became nuclei for the task forces which relentlessly prowled the Pacific. On April 2, 1942, the new carrier Hornet, with 16 United States Army Mitchell bombers, B-25s, wedged on its deck, sailed from San Francisco with a message for Tokyo. Escorted by the Enterprise task force to a point 850 miles from the Japanese capital, and thus 2,100 miles from their assigned landing fields in China, the 16 B-25s were taken off the plunging deck of the carrier by their Army crews of 80 men and led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. 4 hours later, they dumped 16 tons of bombs on the Japanese capital and continued westward to China. 15 planes crashed in China after running out of gasoline, while the 16th found internment in Siberia. With Chinese help, 71 of 80 crew members returned to America. The whole episode was more spectacular than fruitful, but it did give a great boost to American morale and frightened the Japanese so badly that they kept 4 Japanese air groups in Japan for defense. During this period of the war, the United States had amazingly correct information regarding Japanese war plans. Some of this came from our control over the Japanese codes, but much of the most critical intelligence came from other sources which have never been revealed. Through these channels, while Admiral William Halsey was still en route back from the Tokyo raid with 2 carriers, American naval authorities learned of 2 Japanese projects. The first of these planned to send an invasion force from Rabaul in New Britain, north of New Guinea, to capture Port Moresby on the southern shore of New Guinea. The second plan hoped to extend the Japanese defense perimeter eastward by seizing the Aleutian Islands and Midway Island in the northern Pacific. The former project was frustrated in the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 7th through 8th, 1942, while the second project was disastrously defeated in the decisive Battle of Midway, June 4th, 1942. The Coral Sea, brilliantly blue and white, forms a rectangle more than 1,000 miles wide from east to west and slightly longer from north to south. Open on the south, it is boxed in on the other 3 sides with Australia to the west, the New Hebrides and New Caledonia to the east, and New Guinea and the Solomon Islands to the north. On May 8th, as the Japanese invasion force for Port Moresby came into this area from the northwest, it was intercepted by an American task force including the carriers Lexington and Yorktown. The invasion force was turned back, a small Japanese carrier was sunk, and a large carrier severely damaged, while fires on both American carriers were extinguished. After the battle, however, the Lexington blew apart from gasoline fires ignited by an electric motor spark deep within its hull. Wow. That's kind of interesting. That was actually pretty interesting. Let me get a better picture. No, they're all tiny. That's serious. Okay. Turning the tide, 1942 to 1943, Midway, El Alamein, French Africa, and Stalingrad. That's on page 745. The Second World War was a gigantic conflict because it was an agglomeration. It was an agglomeration of several wars. Each of these wars had a different turning point, but all of these occurred in the year following the surrender of Corregidor on May 6, 1942. The first turning point to be reached in the war between the United States and Japan occurred at Midway on June 4, 1942, while the second was reached in the defeat of the Italo-German attack on Egypt on November 2, 1942. The American war on Germany took a turn for the better with the successful American invasion of French North Africa on November 8, 1942, while at the same time the crucial struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union reached its turn in the long agony at Stalingrad from November 1942 to February 1943. Needless to say, long and bitter exertions were needed to push the three aggressor states back from their points of farthest advance. The Battle of Midway arose from a Japanese trap which was supposed to destroy the rest of the Pacific Fleet, but resulted quite differently. Whatever illusions the Japanese army may have had, the Japanese Navy fully recognized that it could not possibly win in the Pacific until the American fleet was totally destroyed. To achieve this, a trap was set to draw the fleet out from Pearl Harbor by the threat of a Japanese amphibious invasion of Midway Island from the southwest. When the Americans hurried out to attack this invasion fleet at Midway, they were to have been destroyed by the planes from 4 Japanese carriers lying in ambush 200 miles northwest of Midway. The ambush was reversed because Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor had a clear picture of the Japanese plans and sent his own carriers out to spring on the Japanese carriers from a point 200 miles northeast of their position. The American counter-ambush worked because of a most extraordinary series of fortunate chances. The 4 Japanese carriers expected the American counterattack to come from Pearl Harbor after several days' delay, and accordingly felt free to use their own carrier planes to bombard Midway defenses, softening them up for the benefit of the invading force coming up on Midway from the southwest. These bombardment planes had returned from Midway to their carriers and were still feverishly refueling on the flight decks when the American carrier strike came in. 116 planes from the Enterprise and Hornet were followed shortly after by 35 planes from the Yorktown. Caught in a horrible tactical position, the Japanese defended so skillfully that 37 out of 41 American torpedo bombers were lost, but As wave after wage of, all right, there's a typo on page 746. It says wave after wage, WAGE. I think it's supposed to be wave after wave of dive bombers continued to come in. The Japanese defense was saturated, and soon all four carriers were sinking in flames. Before the fourth Japanese carrier went down, it sent off 40 planes, which torpedoed the Yorktown. The American carrier was incapacitated and mistakenly abandoned so that it was easily sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later. This loss, even in combination with the loss of the Lexington in the Coral Sea a month earlier, was a cheap price to pay for the destruction of 5 Japanese carriers in these two areas in the space of 5 weeks, since the United States had an industrial capacity to replace its losses while Japan did not. Two events of November 1942, the British victory at El Alamein and the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, provided tactical lessons in strategic reversal fully as great as those provided in the Pacific 5 months earlier. During most of 1942, the British clung to their lifeline across the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to Malta and Egypt by no more than a fingernail's margin. The Italo-German submarine and air attacks were steadily intensified, while the whole northern shore of the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to the Aegean was under Axis control or sympathetic to it. The Italian foothold on the northern shore of the Mediterranean in Libya was steadily strengthened, largely by German reinforcements, and German pressure was brought to bear on Vichy France to increase Nazi influence in French North Africa. As long as the British were opposed only by Italian forces in the Mediterranean, they were able to keep convoys moving, but on January 10, 1941, the German Air Force intervened in the central Mediterranean with devastating effect. From that point onward, for a period of 2 years until May 1943, it was impossible to get a merchant convoy through the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to Alexandria. Accordingly, the British imperial forces in Egypt had to be supplied by the longer route around Africa. Even British naval vessels found it difficult to pass through the Mediterranean. In the course of 1941, all the British capital ships and carriers in the central and eastern Mediterranean were sunk or damaged so badly they had to be withdrawn. The island of Malta, situated in the middle of the Axis supply line from Italy to Africa, was pulverized from the air for more than 19 months, until October 1942, and all vessels, even submarines, had to be withdrawn from its harbors. Efforts to replenish its supplies of food and ammunition became suicidal, but it had to be continued as its civilian population stood up magnificently under the pounding and could not be left without supplies by the fighting services. For months at a time, no convoys could get through, but each time supplies approached exhaustion, fragments of a convoy arrived with enough to keep the island fighting a little longer. In June 1941, 10 merchant ships from Alexandria and 6 from Gibraltar were sent simultaneously in order to divide the enemy, although protected by a battleship, 2 carriers, 11 cruisers, and 44 destroyers. Only 2 of the 16 cargo vessels arrived at Malta at a cost of 3 destroyers and a cruiser sunk and many others damaged. 2 months later, when Malta had only a week's supply left, 14 very fast merchant vessels were sent from Gibraltar with an escort of 2 battleships, 4 carriers, 7 cruisers, and 25 destroyers. 5 badly damaged merchant ships reached Malta with a naval loss of a carrier, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer sunk. Another carrier and 2 cruisers badly damaged. This severe fighting in the central Mediterranean arose from the vital need by both sides to control the communications of that area. The northern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, from west to east, was controlled by Franco-Spain, by Vichy France, by the Axis, and by Turkey. Spain was pro-Axis, but unable, through economic weakness, to intervene in the war until Britain was thoroughly beaten. Vichy France remained ambiguous and a major leak in the economic blockade of Europe until November 1942. Turkey was pro-British, but unable to offer anything more than benevolent neutrality. On the southern shore of the Mediterranean, Libya, consisting of Tripolitania in the west and Cyrenaica in the east, was in between Egypt and French North Africa and could be used as a base to attack either because of the Axis supply lines from Italy and Sicily. These lines were greatly strengthened by the Axis conquest of Greece and Crete in May and June 1941. From this base in Libya, the Axis struck at Egypt 3 times and were answered by 3 British counterattacks. These provide the historian with an amazing sequence of movements in which the battle lines surged across Africa between Egypt and French Tunis, a distance of 1,200 miles. The real struggle was for control of Cyrenaica, and especially for its seaports strung like beads from Benghazi eastward 270 miles by way of Derana and Tobruk to Salom on the Egyptian frontier. If the Germans could control this stretch, they could use Tobruk as a supply port free from interference from Malta, while if British could control it, they could provide air cover for Malta from African fields. The first Axis advance by the Italians under Graziani went no further than Sidi Barrani in Egypt, 50 miles east of Salom, September 1940. This was repulsed by an amazing British advance of 500 miles from Sidi Barrani to El Aghila, 150 miles beyond Benghazi, December 1940 to February 1941. It was to stop this Italian retreat early in 1941 that the Nazis intervened with an air fleet of 500 planes under Kesselring and the famous Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel, a tactical genius, had 3 German divisions, 2 armored and 1 motorized, supported by 7 Italian divisions, 6 infantry and 1 armored. By a series of smashing blows, Rommel advanced eastward to Egypt, destroying most of the British armor on the way, but his advance stopped at Sollum in April 1941. Hitler held up most of the supplies going to Rommel because he needed them in Greece, Crete, and later in Russia. The supply routes to Rommel were very precarious because of British attacks out of Alexandria, only 250 miles to the east, and because of an Australian division left in Tobruk that, although surrounded by Rommel and besieged for months, denied him the use of its port. Damn, Australians going hard. While Rommel's supplies were dwindling and the British Navy was being driven from the central Mediterranean by Axis air power and submarines, the defense of Egypt was being built up by Circum-Africa Supply Line. That means like going around Africa. Over this 10,000-mile route came 951 light tanks, 13,000 trucks, many of these under Lend-Lease by the end of 1941. With this equipment, General Claude Auchinleck attacked Rommel in November 1942, and in 2 months relieved Tobruk and forced the Germans back to El Agheila, January 1942. Within a week, Rommel counterattacked and advanced eastward, being stopped 40 miles west of Tobruk, mid-February 1941. Both sides rested there, while the Western powers feverishly built up their supplies in Egypt. At the end of May 1942, Rommel struck again. This time he captured Tobruk and was finally stopped at El Alamein, only 60 miles short of Alexandria. After 5 days of furious fighting at that point, July 1st through 5th, 1942. In August, General Bernard L. Montgomery, later Field Marshal and 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, replaced General Auchinleck. His forces were equipped with every piece of armament that could be spared from the United States, including 700 two-engine bombers, 1,000 fighting planes, over 400 M4 Sherman tanks, 90 new American self-propelled guns, and 25,000 trucks and other vehicles. On October 23rd, while Rommel was absent in Germany, Montgomery attacked the Axis forces at their strongest point along the coast road, and after 12 days of violent combat, broke through the German position. Rommel returned, but could not stop the rout. By November 20th, he had lost Benghazi and was still retreating. Worse than that, on November 8th, only 4 days after El Alamein, Rommel heard that large-scale American invasion of French North Africa had already landed at 3 points. These had to be hurled backwards, for the German forces could be cut off if the Americans passed Tunis. The American invasion of North Africa on November 8, 1942, Operation Torch, arose as a compromise of quite dissimilar strategic ideas in Moscow, London, and Washington. Stalin was insistent that the Anglo-Americans must open a second front in Western Europe in 1942 in order to reduce Nazi pressure on Russia. He was completely unreasonable in his attitude, going so far as to taunt Churchill with cowardice at the Moscow Conference in August 1942. In London, there was, indeed, great lack of faith in any possible invasion of Europe. Instead, there was hope that the Germans could be brought to terms by air attacks and economic blockade after perhaps 10 years. Churchill went a little further by speaking of possible invasion of the continent from the Mediterranean through what he mistakenly called the soft underbelly of the Axis. In Washington, the military leaders were convinced from the earliest stages of the war that Hitler could not be beaten without a full-scale invasion of Western Europe. As early as April 1942, Harry Hopkins and General Marshall appeared in London with plans for an invasion of Western Europe by 30 American and 18 British divisions. The British were very reluctant, but as Stalin kept insisting on a second front in 1942, Roosevelt on July 25th obtained, as a compromise, an agreement to invade French North Africa in the autumn of 1942. There was hardly time for adequate planning and no time for adequate training before the landings were made on November 8th. Although the operation was a joint British-American venture, the British role was little publicized to avoid antagonizing French, especially French naval feelings, which were still hostile because of the British attacks on Dakar, Oran, and Syria. In addition, a difficult problem arose about the question of political cooperation with the French authorities in North Africa. The British had placed most of their faith in General de Gaulle, but it soon became clear that he had very little support in North Africa and was too difficult and uncooperative personally to be made part of the invasion plans. The Americans, who had maintained diplomatic relations with Vichy, believed it would be necessary to replace the local Vichy leaders as soon as North Africa had been conquered. They pinned their faith on the heroic General Henry Girard, who had obtained considerable publicity by his spectacular escapes from German prisons in both World Wars. Unfortunately, as the invasion proceeded, it was discovered that Girard had even less influence in North Africa than de Gaulle, especially in the French Navy, which was providing the chief combat resistance to the invasion. Accordingly, in order to stop the fighting, it became necessary to make a deal with Admiral Darlan, who was in North Africa at the time. This deal, which recognized Darlan as the chief political authority in all French North Africa, with Girard as his commander-in-chief, has given rise to much controversy. It was argued that the high principles enunciated in our declared war aims, especially in the Atlantic Charter, were being unnecessarily sacrificed by making a deal with an unprincipled Nazi collaborator such as Darlan. The deal was justified by its makers, General Mark Clark, on behalf of General Eisenhower, and Ambassador Robert Murphy on behalf of President Roosevelt, on grounds of military urgency. This argument is rather weak, since Darlan's ceasefire order, made at noon on November 8th, was not obeyed in two combat areas, Morocco and Oran, and obeyed only partially in the third area, Algiers. And by the time the formal deal was made on November 11th, organized fighting by the French forces had ceased everywhere. The additional justifications made to the effect that some type of legal continuity with the Vichy regime had to be established to avoid French guerrilla resistance involves too many unknown factors to prevent any convincing judgment of its value. It seems weak, since the German reaction to the Allied invasion of North Africa took an anti-French direction which was so drastic that any French resistance to American or British would have been clearly pro-German and thus most unlikely behavior for any patriotic Frenchman. In any case, the Darlan deal was soon swallowed up in the swift pace of events and was personally ended when Darlan was assassinated by his French enemies on December 24th. Interesting. The Anglo-American invasion of North Africa, known as Operation Torch, and under the overall command of General Eisenhower, involved landings at 3 points on the Atlantic coast of Morocco near Casablanca by a force coming from North America, and at 2 points on the Mediterranean coast in Algeria by forces coming from England. The Morocco attack was almost foolhardy since it involved carrying 35,000 completely inexperienced and inadequately trained troops with 250 tanks, all in 102 vessels, a distance of 4,000 miles across the ocean to make a night landing on a hostile coast. In spite of these obstacles and tenacious French resistance at certain points, the operation was a success and fighting ceased in 3 days. The other portion of the operation, Torch, the landings in Algeria, were on a larger scale since they involved 49,000 American and 23,000 British troops and were equally successful. By November 14th, the Allies were moving eastward into Tunisia to cut off Rommel's retreat from the east, and by November 29th, they were only 12 miles from Tunis. From that point, they were hurled backwards by the Germans. Hitler's reaction to Torch were Hitler's reactions to Torch were vigorous. All France was occupied by Nazi forces. His efforts to capture the French fleet at Toulon were frustrated when most of the vessels were scuttled at their anchorages or were sunk trying to escape from the harbor. As early as November 10th, German airborne troops, with Laval's blessing, were occupying Tunisia. These German forces held up the Allied advance from the west, inflicting a bitter defeat on the American forces at the Kasserine Pass in February 1943. In this way, Rommel, who had been forced out of El Agheila by Montgomery on December 13th, was able to withdraw westward into Tunisia and to take a stand along the Mareth line below Gabes in southeastern Tunisia in February. During the third week in January 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their staffs met in a secret conference at Casablanca. Once again, the Americans had to struggle against English reluctance to commit themselves to any cross-channel invasion of Europe, to any offensive against Japan, or indeed to any long-range planning. From the compromises of the conference emerged agreement to postpone any cross-channel operation, to keep up pressure on Germany in Europe by air attacks, and to allow the United States to take any offensive actions against Japan which would not jeopardize the priority still given to the defeat of Germany. Two other decisions were to precede the military occupation of Sicily and to demand the unconditional surrender of three totalitarian powers. Naturally, the military decision on Sicily was kept secret, but the political decision on unconditional surrender was published with great fanfare, and at once initiated a controversy which still continues. The controversy over unconditional surrender is based on the belief that the expression itself is largely meaningless and had an adverse influence by discouraging any hopes within the Axis countries that they could find a way out by slackening their efforts, by revolting against their governments, or by negotiating some kind of conditional surrender. There seems to be little doubt that the demand for unconditional surrender was incompatible with earlier statements that we were fighting the German, Japanese, and Italian governments rather than the German, Japanese, and Italian peoples, and that this demand, by destroying this distinction, to some extent solidified our enemies and prolonged their resistance especially in Italy and Japan, where opposition to war was widespread and active. Even in Germany, the demand for unconditional surrender discouraged those more moderate and peace loving Germans upon which our post war policy towards Germany must be based and, in fact, has been based. But in 1943, and for most of the duration of the war, the Allied powers had neither time nor inclination to look ahead towards any post war policy with respect to Germany and issued the demand for unconditional surrender without any analysis of its possible effects on the enemy peoples during the war or after it was over. The demand for unconditional surrender was made rather as a morale booster for the Allied powers themselves, and in this function it may well have had some slight influence at the time. As the Allied leaders were conferring in Casablanca after turning back the German assaults in Africa, Soviet forces were inflicting an even greater defeat on Hitler in Eastern Europe. Hitler's Russian campaign of 1942 was very similar to that of 1941, except that his original plan was restricted to a single aim: the capture of the oil fields of the Caucasus. The German forces, consisting of 44 infantry, 10 armored, and 6 motorized divisions, along with 43 satellite divisions and 700 planes, were to drive along the north shore of the Black Sea, pass through a congested bottleneck at Rostov, and capture the Soviet oil fields, the chief of which, at Baku, was 700 miles below Rostov. To protect the long northern flank of this drive, other German attacks were ordered further north towards Voronezh and towards Stalingrad on the Volga River. The German offensive did reach the Caucasus, advancing almost as far as Grozny, 400 miles below Rostov, but did not capture the chief oil fields. As in the 1941 offensive, scores of Soviet divisions were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners were captured, but no vital injury was inflicted on the Soviet Union. Suddenly, on July 18th, after 7 weeks of advance, Hitler ordered the capture of Stalingrad. Since all the available armored forces had been put into the Caucasus offensive, where they uselessly clogged up Rostov, the attack on Stalingrad could not begin until September 12th. After 2 months of savage house-to-house fighting, the Germans had possession of almost all of the city, but it had to be completely demolished. In late November, Russian counteroffensives north and south of Stalingrad broke through Romanian armies on either side of the German Sixth Army and joined together on its rear. Hitler forbade any retreat or any effort by the Sixth Army to fight its way westward out of the trap. Instead, he undertook to supply the Sixth Army from the air until new German forces could break in to relieve it. The surrounded Sixth Army consisted of 20 divisions, about 270,000 men, including 3 armored and 3 motorized divisions. Although a force of this size required about 1,500 tons of supplies each day, the Luftwaffe was never able to deliver as much as 200 tons a day and lost about 300 planes in the effort. Nor could the German forces to the west, although only 40 miles away, fight their way in to the Sixth Army. While this was going on at Stalingrad from December 1942 through January 1943, another Soviet offensive, striking down from the northeast toward Rostov, was trying to cut off the whole German force in the Caucasus by capturing the city of Rostov and thus closing the bottleneck north of the Sea of Azov. The German withdrawal from the Caucasus began on the first day of 1943. With extraordinary skill, the Germans succeeded in keeping the Rostov Passage open, although by January 23rd it was no more than 30 miles wide. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, although frozen, starved, and hardly able to fight for lack of supplies, was not permitted to surrender, because as soon as it did so, the three Soviet armies which had surrounded it would be freed to drive west and close the Rostov Passage. On January 23rd, General Friedrich von Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, accepted Hitler's radio orders to fight to the last man in order to gain time. A week later, Hitler promoted him to field marshal, and 2 days later he surrendered. Of 270,000 Germans originally surrounded, over 100,000 were dead. 34,000 had been evacuated by air, and 93,000 surrendered. 10 days after Paulus's surrender, the Germans abandoned Rostov. For the next 2 weeks, it looked as if a new Soviet offensive from Voronezh might cut off the whole German army group south, but Field Marshal von Manstein succeeded in reestablishing a stable defensive line by April 1st, just about at the line where the German offensive of 1942 had begun 11 months earlier. But in that 11 months, Hitler had lost about 38 German divisions, and an equal number of satellite divisions had reduced all German divisions from 9 battalions to 6, and failed to capture the Caucasus oil fields, Moscow, or Leningrad, and had not been able to cut the Murmansk Railway. Alright, let's see how much further this chapter goes, because this is just kind of running on. Whoa. There's like no breaks at all. Alright, I'm just going to stop there. It's on page 753 if you want to keep reading. The PDF is linked in the description. I just wanted to look up this one thing. Let's see. World War II. Let's see if this is real. I'm pretty sure it was real. Yeah, I know about the North African campaign. What about the soccer game? Oh, wait, it was on Christmas. That's right. Yeah, here we go. See, this is crazy, right? Like, even in the middle of World War II, they called a truce on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day to mingle and exchange food and souvenirs. There was joint burial ceremonies and prisoner swaps, while several meetings ended in caroling. They also played football against each other. Hostilities continued in some sectors, while others, the sides settled on little more than arrangements to recover the bodies. Oh, that was in the First World War, wasn't it? Oh, interesting. Christmas 1941. Many accounts of the truce involve one or more football matches played in no man's land. All right, that was World War I, though. Interesting. All right. I thought it was World War II, but it was World War One, though. But still, kind of interesting thing. You never see that anymore these days. They're like, look, man, we got to take a break. It's Christmas. Let's stop killing each other. All right. That chapter was kind of a run-on chapter. I mean, it kind of went, the Japanese stuff was definitely interesting. It's definitely still up in the air because obviously the American military knew that there was some type of attack planned, and they didn't really put up too much defense, and it was to their benefit at the time, for public opinion, since they wanted to attack, but they knew that the public was against the attack. The fact that Japan did attack basically completely changed public opinion, right? So blocking the Japanese attack wasn't actually beneficial to the United States at that time. So you can see how some people could kind of infer that maybe they turned a blind eye type of thing where they knew it was coming, but they didn't really put up much defense against it. Kind of similar to the 9/11 type of thing. And they even have said that, we needed something like a Pearl Harbor in order to prosecute the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the political intrigue between the British, German, Russian stuff, it's very confusing because it's just while this war is going on, they're bombing people and all this other stuff, and they just can't come to a conclusion or an agreement. All the ambassadors and politicians, while people are dying. And I get it. That's how wars are. And they didn't really have as much information back then. But, hopefully we can avoid a world war like that ever happening again. Maybe, possibly. Probably not. But anyway, I'm going to end it here. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this. But otherwise, have a good day and peace.